This is Reading at Homes with Holmes for the Bookmaster and His Emissary, Chapter 7. Today we have Sebastian giving the summary for our previous episode, and then after that we will jump right in. Chapter 7 is only 17 pages, but I already have way too many questions, so we'll be able to fill the full episode regardless. But for now, Sebastian, you can take us away with your summary.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you. The Chapter 6 summary, The Triumph of the Left Hemisphere. Whether you've been following the Holmes clan and company since the start of our journey back at the preface, or you're just joining us now as we continue on our journey, we have arrived at Chapter 7 on the imitation and evolution of culture. I'm just as excited as you are to continue where we left off. However, in order to make sure we don't forget where we came from, a brief recap of Chapter 6, The Triumph of the Left Hemisphere, is in order. Going through your first read through the book, it is easy to paint the left hemisphere in a suspicious light. The chapters prior to Chapter 6 mention the left hemisphere in snippets, allowing us to get a glimpse into the left hemisphere's perspective on the world. These prior chapters focus on providing context related to other aspects of the human experience, like the primacy of the right hemisphere in Chapter 5. If you're like me, this left hemisphere leaves the reader with a curiosity about what the left hemisphere is and does and how this affects us as individuals in relation to the world as a whole. Thank you, McGilchrist, because thanks to his contextual thinking, he dedicated Chapter 6 to the left hemisphere, where he lays out an honest assessment of the left hemisphere in further detail. In Chapter 6, it goes on to explain the roles and responsibilities of the left hemisphere in relationship to the right hemisphere, and by extension, the world in which we interact with and inhabit as a whole. McGilchrist does this by examining split-brain subjects post-surgery, allowing the reader to gain a key insight into some of the left hemisphere's biases towards enacting its own will. He explains the concepts of something he refers to as hemispheric utilization bias, where he explains as personalities we can have characteristics or personal biases towards either hemisphere. One starts to get a rich understanding of the left hemisphere from the levels of interaction between the two hemispheres. McGilchrist lays out how the hemispheres compete to complete tasks during the millisecond to millisecond moments of human life, otherwise known as level 1, where we start to see just how fierce and even sometimes one-sided this competition can sometimes be is at the phenomenological level, or what he would refer to as level 2, where each hemisphere has a longer time span to work on enacting its will towards the experiential world. He goes on to explain things like the 5 symmetries that lay out in even further detail the degree to which each hemisphere asymmetrically competes with the other. And I'll just briefly list them. So you've got the ontological asymmetry, which is the primacy of the right hemisphere's interaction with whatever exists. You have the asymmetry of function, the product of the left hemisphere's need to be returned to the realm of the right in order to live. Asymmetry of means, dominated by the left hemisphere, it benefits from an asymmetry of means. The means of argument, the 3 L's, language, logic, and linearity. Asymmetry of structure, how systems, left hemisphere, can devalue that which cannot necessarily be explained or systematized, right hemisphere. Asymmetry of interaction, the asymmetries of how the hemispheres interact with the world, the left having the ability more so to inhibit the right hemisphere. He further paves the way for the reader to better understand the left hemisphere, explaining how the left hemisphere is overconfident in its abilities to solve problems and quick to make decisions based on small amounts of information given to it by the right hemisphere. This idea is further built up when McGilchrist explains how the problem arises when cohesion/balance is lost between the hemispheres. He believes we achieve a balance when the left hemisphere remembers to return its discernments to the right hemisphere for more context so that it may live. And that's my summary.
Hmm. It's funny because that summary reminds me of many other chapters, but I mean, I think that's the nature of Chapter 6, just how all-encompassing it really is.
Well, he paints a picture starting from Chapter 1, and then he just keeps building on it. And I think that's why there's so much work in the previous chapters that is referenced in even the later chapters.
Hmm. And now that we're on Chapter 7, we're actually on part 2 of the entire book, so we've come a
Right. And
long way.
his stab, from what I've gathered in the multiple times that I've run through his work on this one, is to paint a solid argument based on his thesis. This is what your brain does. Like, period. Doesn't leave much really to speculation. Like there are some areas where, like he had said in earlier chapters that we discussed in previous podcasts, where, you know, he apologizes if he's stepping on the expertise of those who have dedicated their lives to certain dynamics. But taken as a whole, this is how he's setting the stage for what I feel is now the most important part of the whole book. And that is where we're going to go. What does this look like then? Like once we see the reality of, you know, okay, like we say in our household, right? Know what you are to better negotiate who you are. Well, the negotiating of who you are is the most dynamic part of the human experience. And so now he's going to lay out the case for, so what's this going to look like, and how has it looked like in times past?
Mm. I think he also apologizes in this chapter again because he starts to get into the, well, I guess I'll just screen share and then read kind of the first intro he gives, which expresses his intentions throughout the entirety of part two. Yeah, my first screenshot was literally just this, again, first intro. Knowing what we do about the nature of the different worlds each hemisphere brings about, and understanding their relationship, we can, I believe, begin to see a pattern in the course of Western history. I believe there has been a succession of shifts of balance between the hemispheres over the last 2,000 years, and the second part of this book will explore this point of view, with the particular aim of understanding what is happening in the contemporary world. In the history of the West shows times when a move forward in one hemisphere releases a move forward in the other, according to Nietzsche's assertion that these two very different drives, Matthew would like this, the Apollonian and Dionysian, exist side by side, mostly in open conflict, stimulating and provoking one another to give birth to ever new, more vigorous offspring, in whom they perpetuate the conflict inherent in the opposition between them. But we have now reached a point where, for reasons I have suggested, the balance has swung too far, perhaps irretrievably far, towards the Apollonian left hemisphere, which now appears to believe that it can do anything, make anything, on its own. Like the emissary in the fable, it has grown tired of its subservience to the master, and as a result, the survival of the domain they share is, in my view, in the balance. Now, again, if anybody has screenshots or points of importance that they would like to bring forth, do so. I know the last half, I'm going to have a lot of questions. They're philosophical questions at that, but in the meantime.
Yeah, I got one that's relatively close to what you did and just kind of pushes the part you read forward just a little bit. It's right at the beginning of the subsection, why have the shifts of balance occurred? Some people may reasonably doubt that any such shifts have occurred. At any one period of human history, there will, it goes without saying, be many different factors at play, and many, sometimes conflicting, points of view that will have been expressed. Individuals, as befits individuals, will fail to conform to an overall pattern. It is in the nature of generalization that there will be many exceptions, and experts will always disagree with any generalization, as experts should. Fine-grained analysis is the expert's prerogative. However, the more fine-grained the expert analysis, the more difficult it may be to see an overall pattern. It cannot be other than the view from close up. This will inevitably lead some to the conclusion that no pattern exists, but I believe this to be a mistake. One has to stand back in order to see patterns at all. There is a necessary distance for such recognition to work. If I am right that there have been shifts in hemisphere balance, why have they come about? To the historian, a multitude of social and economic factors will inevitably be involved in the process whereby many events unfolded which led to such cataclysmic movements in the history of ideas, and I have no doubt that, as always, chance also played an important role. However, such social and economic factors inevitably exist in an inextricably involved dynamic relationship with changes in the way we look at the world, and are indeed simply part of another way of describing the process. Each aspect that we choose to bring into focus makes a different aspect stand forth out of a nexus in which no one element can be said to have caused all the others. since what look like elements are simply facets of the indivisible human condition. If one holds one set of factors steady, say, the economic, then one appears to have accounted for everything in those terms. But hold another set steady, whether social, institutional, intellectual, or of any other kind, and the picture may look equally convincing. The fact is that nothing can in reality be held steady in this way. All is in a constant state of dynamic interaction, and one of the factors in this interaction, I suggest, has been the need to resolve the inherently unstable relationship between the worlds delivered by the two hemispheres.
Mm.
Like this,
I,
this is a kind of a neat chapter because it's simultaneously a big setup for the entire second half of the book, and a bit of a rebuttal of the argument that if you're hyper focusing on the brain, you're failing to account for a whole plethora of other factors that would contribute to shifts in society. So, like, yeah, you could look at economics and whatever, but what everything, be it an economist or an intellectual or an artist, whatever, they all have the same thing in common, which is their brains. So, if we're going to look at any aspect of the human condition that's responsible for shifts in history, then we should probably start with at least the biggest point of common ground that every individual has ever had in common.
that's the one of the things that going through Matthew's work and even in MayCee's presentation that she just did on the hemispheres, why she wanted to emphasize so much and round off her presentation talking about the BRICS nations. And because that is there were some people where it's like learning about the brain, why do this thing? And it's because it literally maps onto the external world, because we are imprinting on the world as that's what we do. So her emphasis and then going between Matthew's work and then her trying to connect it, even McGilchrist, I think, alludes to figures such as this chapter in particular. He alluded to more people that I learned about through Matthew's work, like even Kant and then um, Confucius. He talks and starts connecting some of those, the actual philosophies that are in the world. And well, again, that's the whole point of this part too, is now giving people practical examples for those who don't. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, well, my favorite thing about this book is probably going to be the second half because it's really where the metal meets the meat of his argument, where you actually get to see the downstream consequences of his theory. And people understand that this book was written like what, 15 years ago, 10, 15 years ago. So, and he paints a pretty accurate picture of what he anticipated today would look like based upon his theory and, you know, a startling level of accuracy for his day writing this book.
Mm-hmm. There's a good example here. Dad, do you want to read this for me? And I'll tell you when to stop.
Sure. I'm assuming I'm starting at the I do not propose.
Correct.
Also going to just add a little color commentary because we also have to bear in mind there are certain aspects of Gilchrist's work that have reason to be challenged, and we keep the 4-to-1 dynamic in our minds, even in this household. I'm saying it a little bit ahead of time as a disclaimer because a lot of the times there's individuals in certain circles throughout all the types of influencers that we pay attention to in this family, and it's a wide range of them, believe you me. Where you'll have, say, for example, those who look at the book 1984, and they'll be like, well, he was a prophet, like he's wrote this all down, and it was like a warning. It's like, no, it wasn't warning. That was a blueprint. And most people don't understand the background and the people that were associated with the author of 1984. So that has to be also bared in mind, even when you're plowing away at like a Jordan Peterson or an Iain McGilchrist or an Aleister Crowley. It's like whatever it is that you're going to consume, including this work, we have to bear in mind we don't know everybody that was around all of these individuals. Was there an agenda for why they're putting up their theories? So we're trying to navigate as honestly as we can the downstream consequences of a regular group of plebs, family members, taking something revolutionary to us as people that weren't putting in this type of accountable effort into understanding what we are. So I just kind of want to toss that out there, because now that we do, like you alluded to, Madison, we're starting to understand these characters and these references, even the Apollonian and the Dionysian through Nietzsche's work. And we know a lot of the Theosophists and how that movement came to come to pass and how it's had its downstream influence. But that doesn't mean that it was a negative influence on everybody who went and did the research, because even some of the people that we hold with high esteem in their research capability, like Matthew Ehret, Alex Craner, Tom Luongo, Courtney Turner, whatever, it's like these are people that still, like, they're reading and studying the works of these bad men or misguided men. So does that make them bad because they're busy trying to sort out what it is that might have been some, not all of the motivation behind individuals? So I just kind of want to put that out there, because we're going to see some of that now that we're going into the second half, and we're going to start to see the thumbprint of Gilchrist's thesis of the brain. But we as a family have also got now historical context that we get to bring in addition to his thesis, because some of the events that he uses to help bolster his thesis with as evidence, we actually see it as, yeah, like this really plays, evidentially speaking, it plays, because we now understand some of the narratives in behind these characters that set the stage for what we would call a downstream proclivity of left hemispheric thinking to play out on the world. So anyways, just a little segue, wanted that to kind of flow into things. But yes, now I will read. In the second part of the book, I shall consider what the principal shifts in Western culture reveal about themselves, specifically within the frame of this metaphor. I will begin with the rise of the written word, the use of currency, the origin of drama, and some facets of the new kind of civilization that erupted in the 6th century BC Athens. But we'll concentrate attention on the regeneration of Western civilization in the Renaissance, the upheavals of the Reformation, the rise of the Enlightenment, the transition to Romanticism, and the emergence of modernism and postmodernism. All I can hope to do in these chapters is to point to a few characteristics that have relevance for the topic of this book. It goes without saying that to deal in what is no more than a series of inevitable short chapters with topics so vast that each would now be considered too great for a whole lifetime of research is inevitably to be hugely selective. And there will be those who think I should not have been so foolhardy as to attempt it at all. To them, I can only say that I am wholly conscious of the pitfalls, but still feel that unless we are quite sure that there could never be an overall pattern to be discerned, we are obliged, in full knowledge of the temerity of the undertaking, to make the attempt. I do not propose to deal in any detail with non-Western culture. Partially, this is a function of my ignorance. Partially, the scope of such a book would threaten to be unmanageable. I also wonder if the same cataclysmic changes in the intellectual climate are really to be found outside of the West. I will have some reflections to make towards the end of the book on hemisphere balance in Far Eastern cultures, which suggest that the two hemispheres enjoy a better symbiosis than they do in the West.
Mhm.
But there may have been important shifts in other cultures, possibly coincident in some cases with those in the West. Karl Jaspers certainly thought there was a crucial shift in the way we see the world that occurred not only in the West, but in China and India, and the same time that it occurred in ancient Greece between about 1800 and 200 BC. He called this a pivotal period, or Aschenzeit, sometimes translated Axle Age, in world history. And in this, or in his The Origin and Goal of History, identified common characteristics between some of the greatest thinkers of the period, including Plato, Buddha, and Confucius. This was also the period of Heraclitus, Lao Tzu, the Upanishads, and the Hebrew prophets. Similarly, some of the developments in the West have parallels elsewhere. Wait for it. With regard to the Reformation, one could point to other times and places in which the visual image was prescribed and where there was a text-based black and white intolerant fundamentalism at odds with any richer understanding of myth and metaphor. Such tendencies form an important part of the history of some other religions, including Islam. But there is nothing like the extraordinary divarication of culture that seems to have characterized the history of the West. No equivalent of the Enlightenment, with its insistence on just one rectilinear way of conceiving the world. And, because there was no need for it, no romanticism that aimed to redress it. As Max Weber demonstrated in his histories of Chinese and Indian culture and of Judaism, it was only in the West that unchecked acquisitive rationalism in science, capitalism, and bureaucracy took hold.
Yeah. That paints the picture that kind of MayCee was giving at the end of her presentation. And
sorry, Manny, you can go. Oh,
I was just gonna
you go.
No, it was just because Dad alluded to some of the earlier skepticisms or the 4-to-1 rule. I will insert the podcast you did with Matthew and Courtney in the description of this, as well as MayCee's presentation. Now that both are uploaded, and it's a good thing to, if any of those following this, as Sebastian alluded to in his summary, those following our journey, out of the openness and curiosity that our family, started this journey with. It's good to go and listen to the podcast with Courtney, Matthew, and my dad, because she exercises some good discernment about some of the fishy connections surrounding McGilchrist. And there's a lady that will be joining us, hopefully, next reading. And she came to the same conclusion that we did as a clan, which is McGilchrist clearly looking at all of these figures, and he uses Nietzsche, he uses Freud, which we know from Matthew's work, sketchy figures. But because you emphasize so gracefully the 4-to-1 rule in the podcast that you did with them, that's how everybody should be exercising discernment with all things. And the lady, she started with Matthew's work and only really started encompassing McGilchrist as of late after watching all of our videos. And that same conclusion that McGilchrist doesn't acknowledge the oligarchy, there's a naivety there. And that doesn't discard the work itself, again, which is why you still read people's works. That's why Matthew, and one thing about Rachel Wilson that I also enjoyed, she read the works of all of those feminists in order to come up with her conclusion. Matthew reads the works of Thomas Malthus, Freud, Nietzsche. You read them and then you know really how their brain works. So you can discern from then on, because just listening to the podcasts and stuff like that, people change, right? So you can go through and expand upon your model. But when you put it in stasis, that's where people are. That's why you read their works, because that's where they are. And that's where they've stayed for the time being. And that's why Dad, you're even reading his 2 tomes now, Matter with Things 1 and 2, to compare this one, Master and His Emissary, that was written in 2009. And so you look at all these timelines and you read the works, and even as you just read, he explicitly states that he is going to be missing things. So, but that doesn't mean that what Courtney said, to still look at the other factors and everything around him, isn't worth looking into. You should know that even though he's quoting Freud and Nietzsche, you should know where they come from and know that the majority of their works, what was the motive? Because the motive is really important, because they're trying to lead somebody. They have an agenda. Everybody does. It's just which mode of attention, as we always say on our clan, is being applied to it. And McGilchrist explicitly states his attention is to get other people, like our clan, plebs, and anybody, to expand upon the works, because that's ultimately the model that he has chosen to follow, I believe, is his expansionary model. Um, but not to say that he's not lacking. So it's just understanding what Dad, you always say, and our clan does, is that two things can be true at the same time, which is really that 4-to-1 rule. That's really what that means. So I just wanted to say that those two things and some of the skepticisms that people have about Iain McGilchrist, I will put those podcasts in the link below for people to watch and then, exercise their own discernment. But MayCee, did you have something?
Well, just to really, this is going to be awful, but it's like simplifying kind of what you said, but it's more so that it's like if you're not taking a look at this work, then you're not taking a look at it in context, because like we have been mentioning this whole time, it's like if you're wanting to get a better understanding of the world and yourself in it, then you have to grab all sorts of different aspects that you can try to hold in your mind simultaneously, so that way you can try and garner that context. Like what in the previous paragraph that we just read about history, if you look at it just from an economic standpoint, you're going to attribute everything to it. And we are attributing the hemispheres as playing, it's almost like that is our aspect that we are attributing lots of things downstream because of, but there's a reciprocal relationship between all of them. So even if it's just you do look at things economically, you inevitably will start branching out to other things. Like Tom Luongo and Alex Crane are great examples of this. Like they also go down geopolitics because there's so many things that are entrenched in just when you can't look at economics solely alone. So when you look at the hemispheres, you automatically should assume you're never looking at it solely alone. There's
Yeah.
everything's connected to it and everything that you already know. Hence why we fell in love with Matthew, because we always said to him, it's like you have the understanding of what's in this work already, not just because we're projecting our idea of it onto you, but it's also because your work is reciprocated into this one as well. So again, it's not an either or. But I wanted to do page 245, Maddie, because I really think that he does a really good job painting it on for those who are kind of wanting to look at it from an evolutionary perspective, but like he doesn't subscribe wholly to what Darwinian classical evolution tells us about competition. If anything, he leans more towards the cooperative aspect, but also including the both two things true at the same time. So we can just start at how have the shifts of balance occurred. Okay, so first I need to make it clear that despite my pointing in the first few chapters to structural and functional asymmetries that we know took millennia to arise and even began to arise in other species, I am not suggesting that the major shifts in the history of ideas involved fluctuations in the structure of the brain over the tiny timescales of recent history. It is conceivable that, were it possible to scan the brain of how do you say that? Chian humans, say in the 8th century BC, one might find some small but possibly measurable differences in the structure, or more probably in the functioning of the brain compared with the brains of those who lived 1,000 years earlier, or with the modern human brain. But such changes could take place only over very long time scales. As to what is actually happening in the brain when the more recent swings, those of the last 500 years or so, take place, nothing is visible, at least nothing on a scale that we could actually measure. Is there anything going on at the brain level at all? I think the answer is yes. Our experience of the world helps to mold our brains, and our brains help to mold our experience of the world. Patterns of brain function, if not changes in visible structure, are likely to be involved, but by what processes? Classical natural selection, which depends on the very slow process of random mutation, with environmental selective pressures then acting over generations to favor certain mutations above others, requires long periods of time. It is just about conceivable that this operated in the ancient Greek situation, since this arose on the back of the incursion of a new population into the central Mediterranean at this time, with a different gene pool. In that sense, this change is quite different from those that came afterwards in modern Europe. and the specific migrational factors which applied to ancient Greece do not apply to other contemporary or earlier civilizations, which may help to account for the very considerable differences between Greek and, say, Egyptian or Mesopotamian cultures, and still more, of course, Eastern cultures. Genetic shifts might also explain the extraordinary decline which followed the overrunning of the Roman Empire by Goths, Huns, and Franks in the 4th and 5th centuries AD, since however much one may admire aspects of life in what used to be called the Dark Ages, effectively, whole ways of thinking and being, whole aspects of the phenomenological world simply disappeared in the West for nearly 1,000 years. But the later evolution of ideas, from the Renaissance on, is simply not susceptible to this kind of argument, because the time periods are far too short, and there aren't any major migrations of population that I'm aware of that might change the European gene pool sufficiently. I'll just continue if that's okay. So there are other aspects of transmission which do not depend on Darwinian natural selection alone. There is, for example, the Baldwinian effect, which acts as an accelerator on the process. This refers to the way in which we do not mate at random, but selectively promote a certain gene or genes by choosing a mate who has also got the characteristics for which the gene or genes encode. An articulate man is more likely to marry an articulate woman. Similarly, we alter the environment so that it favors the genes we carry. The articulate develop a society in which articulacy is at premium, with the result that the inarticulate are, in theory at least, at a reproductive disadvantage compared with the articulate. I can't believe this can be having much of an effect. It's still too slow, and mostly it's not true to the facts of human history to suggest that the characteristics we are talking about in this book made much difference to gene reproduction. Despite this, there are thought to be mechanisms whereby brain capacities and cognitive abilities acquired during a single human lifetime could be transmitted to the next generation. These are known as epigenetic mechanisms because they do not depend on alterations in the actual sequence of nucleotides in the DNA within the genes, but on factors which influence what is expressed by the same DNA. Consider this. On the face of it, it's odd that gene sequence in every cell in the body is the same. A kidney cell, though structurally and functionally different from a muscle cell, is exactly the same in respect of its DNA. And yet each kind of cell gives rise only to its own kind of tissue. This is because only parts of the gene sequence in each case gets to be expressed. Similarly, processes such as DNA methylation, alteration of the histone molecules in chromatin, which forms the core round which the double helix spirals, mitochondrial transmission, and X chromosome inactivation modulate expression of parts of the genome and form possible mechanisms for learnt behaviors to be transmitted. This is because use of certain cell functions by the organism during its lifetime actually alters the structure of that cell, leading to what has been called cell memory. This is a bit like the way in which the structure of a neuronal connection in the brain changes with use, so as to promote preferential use of the same connection in future, part of a process of solidification of mind by brain, which underwrites the phenomenon of memory. Cultural developments can be transmitted through genetic mechanisms, just as the structure and functioning of the brain has influenced the evolution of culture. The evolution of culture has had its influence on the brain. Do you want me to read that last thing?
Yeah, read the quote.
Okay. The relationship resembles one of reciprocating interaction, in which culture is generated and shaped by biological imperatives, while the course of genetic evolution shifts in response to cultural innovations. Epigenetic rules may predispose mental development to take certain specific directions in the presence of certain kinds of cultural information. That's pretty huge, what I just read, because if based on epigenetics, what you're doing is you're not necessarily changing the structure of your brain in terms of the DNA sequence, but how you, I guess it's like a muscle, which ones you kind of choose to practice can change the behavior of what you're working with. And then we already kind of know that how, like, even habits, right? It's like, how do you have a habit if you're not already going predisposed towards a path that you kind of set yourself up for? And this leads really well into what we'll discuss later on, which is like imitation and how this plays onto the macro of um, culture, because what you choose to, I guess, imitate and what you choose to, so since we always talk about mode of attention, and it was kind of in my previous presentation, if you go to watch the 3 hour one,
Mhm.
um, is that what you choose to imitate, what you choose to put into your zeitgeist. It's almost like I've been saying a metaphor, or not really, I don't know if it's a metaphor, but I've been saying something with Maddie a lot, which is when you're standing in the kitchen, and I've said this in my presentation, but I'll say it here now. If you're standing in the kitchen, you're more likely probably to be thinking about things associated with the kitchen, like, oh, maybe food or all these things, right? So if you set up a mental environment in your own head, you've set up a kitchen, you're automatically predisposed to what certain pathways your brain's going to be kind of going towards. And then that is setting up, and we already know that how you think and how you behave plays out into the real world. And what that means, though, is that you are also someone who is being imitated, right? So then people are looking at you and they're seeing what it is that you're doing and what it is that you're emanating. And then they might choose to decide to do this thing. But it's so that's why it's very interesting, because the shifts in what it is, these cultural shifts, it's almost like I use the analogy, I guess, of like a river where there's permanence within impermanence because it flows, right? But it's like there is selection, like based on what you're imitating, based on what people are choosing to imitate from you, from them. There is almost like a molding. I feel like culture, we play a huge part in the molding of that, and I think that this kind of plays into that when it comes to the brain epigenetic level. But
Yeah, that's what Sebastian said too about in his summary about utilization bias. That's a proclivity, as we say in our clan, that utilization bias starts to appear because of, again, just like a muscle. Kyle's the one that taught me that if you don't use certain muscles and if you don't go out of your way to use each part of each muscle, that they will start to allocate, the cells will allocate funds, and those synapses about between the neuronal connections will start to allocate to where you are using them. So that whole principle of epigenetics is simple to me to believe because we see that on a daily basis with things like muscle structure and crap like that. So it's the same thing with neuronal pathways. If That's why mode of attention is so important, and attending to which hemisphere you are trying to apply, although it's not dichotomous, you can have more of a say and increase the neuronal connection between one hemisphere versus another, which is how those utilization biases come into being, which is why this is important for us to start attending to. Dad, I saw that you unmuted.
Is also set the stage for how we exceed limits to growth,
Yes.
because just like a river, and I'm going to give a little shout out to things like Ben Davidson's work. When you're going to do when the world, so we have individuals that set up, educationally speaking, that things like your Grand Canyon and things like rivers these are slow moving million-year processes that do a thing. But every year there's floods. Every year there's, the mountains give off their runoff, and then you could have more solar influence into the upper atmosphere. Honga Tonga eruption puts more moisture into the stratosphere. So as these variables do their changing, which is much like how our hemispheres are constantly in that flux, this is how you can get cultural leaps.
Mm.
And that is, I mean, and the sun would even play a role in that too, to a degree, but that's a topic for another time. But the thing is like, that's the stage got set there because he actually, it's not that he wanted to throw out Darwin, although he kind of pitches him over to the waistband a little bit here in what he set, but he set the stage for what is the exceeding of the limits to growth. And because of the way humans because we have the most impact on one another and in the environment with regards to how to set up our culture, because it really is our culture that we're setting up. And when we get these jumps, well, if it isn't the brain that's setting the stage to do the thing in response to the world that it's in, hence the river metaphor, right? The absence of no for the water running, and it goes up against certain banks, and then it's like, no, can't go that way. So then it just goes the other way, and then it ambles because of the laws. Some would say God's laws, some would say science, natural laws, whatever. It's going to do the thing. Like, it's going to do the thing regardless of whether we wanted it to or not. And that's what the brain does. And then there are those brains out there, those people, and this is where I like the fact that he sets the stage for this could be a gene pool thing, but it's not just a gene pool thing. And that's very, very important.
Yeah, I'm glad you elaborated. You even elaborated on absence of no. MayCee, your section kind of continues on. And if Cyril, are you here? Are you present, sir?
Yes, I'm here. I think so, at least.
Would you be willing to do some reading for me?
Sure, I guess. I have to.
Yeah, no, I said, are you willing? I didn't say you have to.
Which essentially means I have to.
No, it doesn't.
Wait, I get a choice?
Yes, you do.
Whatever.
Is that a yes, sir?
That is a yes, but
Oh, that's fantastic to hear, Cyril.
I do want to put out a warning. It's going to be bad.
I'm gonna ignore that. Okay, so I'll tell you when to stop. Read what's on screen for me. It elaborates what on Dad said, connecting what MayCee just read to that absence of no. That is literally how not just our brains seemingly work, because I know this was also a question that it's the idea of free won't is kind of what I allude to, the absence of no. It's not revolutionary when you just think about how it applies in the world and how we apply it. But it's not just something our brains does. It also works on the cellular structure, those synapses and the muscles allocating. It gets explained here. So Cyril, take it away.
Okay. So certain ways of thinking will shape the individual nervous system structurally as well as functionally. The presence or absence of stimulation will affect the number of synapses contacts, right? Can't read. Strengthening some and eliminating others. Identically, the process of development through stimulation is one of reduction and pruning. Pruning. It seems that even at the level of individual neurons, things are brought into being or not by the system either saying no or not saying no. The efficiency rather than just number of synaptic connections is altered by adult learning, and this may concern global units. In other words, cooperative sets of nerve cells. Such changes throughout the nervous system of an individual could then be
epigenetically
transmitted to the next generation, culture and the brain shaping one another overall relatively short time span. Further and beyond any of this, surely ideas do spread by
contagion,
right? And no doubt, in one sense, in competition with one another. Concepts soulmized in Dawkins memes, the culture equivalents of genes. A meme is said to be a replicator of cultural information that one mind transmits verbally or by demonstration to another mind. Examples being tunes, ideas, catchphrases, clothes fashions, ways of making pots or building arches, and other concepts, ideas, theories, opinions, beliefs, practices, habits, dances, and moods, and ultimately and inevitably, including the idea of God, but Dawkins' illusion. This is a perfect example, identically off,
Incidentally.
right, incidentally, of the left hemisphere's way of constructing its own history, not least in its way of breaking culture into atomistic fragments devoid of context, as though snippets of behavior, feeling, or thinking of experience, in other words, stuck together in large enough numbers, can constitute the world in which we live. Memes are seen mechanistically
Mhm.
as replicators, like genes engineering perfect copies of themselves. In the case of gene replication, variation enters in only by accident, by random mutation caused by errors in the transcription, or by interference with gene structure from environmental sources, such as radiation. The machinery makes a mistake or is handed shoddy materials, but as long as it remains in their story, it remains a machine. The equivalent for a meme would be my misremembering a tune or mishearing it in the first place. But memes, if they existed, would be replicating, unlike genes, within a mind whose constant interaction with whatever comes to it leaves nothing unchanged or unconnected. With something else, we are imitators, not copying machines.
Thank you.
That wasn't as bad as I thought it would be.
No, it wasn't. I'm glad you recognized that.
And you did really good, bud. You did good there.
Now, my screenshots do go on because, as MayCee alluded to, this is where he starts fleshing out. I had to reread this part on the memes because I was a little bit confused. One, I'm not as involved in the meme culture, so trying to understand the way he was picturing it as somebody who's not really into it, I was like, wait a minute, what is he trying to compare it to? But I got it eventually, and I thought it was an interesting. I didn't realize that's a way of seeing the meme culture that the left hemisphere that's how it would see its own representation of history, just the replicating of, people say, oh, the 80s are making a comeback again. They just toss that out there as if history is these static moments and decisions by people. So I thought that was a cool connection. And now he starts
They
to get
better
into,
keep in mind that when those kind of statements are made, we have individuals that now we know that gave us the Beatles, that gave us the Rolling Stones, that gave us the Doors. So once again, right now we can bring historical context, because I've done some of the Four Horsemen of the. Because you got Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, like your people like. There's four of them. I'm just forgetting these authors off the
Steven
day.
Pinker.
Yeah, Steven Pinker. Like, I've read lots of their literature because, once again, earlier I was trying to find out where we were on the map, and I did Jordan Peterson's reading list, damn near all of it. And the thing is like this once again when they're literally giving you the left hemisphere's perspective of the selfish gene or the better angels of our nature. And there's so many assumptions so it's not that the information that's being provided doesn't have something to it, but it's incomplete. It's very incomplete. And I actually think that McGilchrist does a good job here with sort of giving that more nuanced basket that's being weaved. A tapestry is actually a better, you're right, all the different singular lines that get interwoven to give you these great tapestries that hang in the halls of castles. So, because memes memes will have their place. It's why there will be individuals that sit back and go, history repeats, or history rhymes. But whereas we talk in our household more like a spiral, right? It's like, so if there's a circular motion that extends out and also came from behind, will go to beyond, and how far will that spiral expand is yet to be determined, because the closer you are to it, the larger it seems. And when you're looking further down at the road at it, you can kind of go, I wonder if we're going to end up here based on where things went. And so it's more like it's our folly if we choose to repeat the past. And yet at some points in time, you also want to make the decision of, well, these are memes that I want to imitate again, because they've held value over that spiral of time. So just something to bear in mind, what I think for context in what we just read.
Yeah, and it's funny that you brought up the spiral, because in the it might have been another podcast that I listened to with Courtney, but she was alluding to the occult symbolism behind Jacob's ladder, which is that very spiral ladder. So again, it's just funny because of the day and age that we're in. Again, though, some people say it's unfortunate because we're at the point where people can no longer trust anything. They have no trust for authority systems, and it can be justified as to why when you do the research that our clan has been doing over the past 4 years. But so they say it's unfortunate because then we're more likely to be divided and conquer than put down what could be considered useless paths of knowledge, or ones that don't connect you to other societies or don't put you down actionable paths. Like for me personally, that I don't like the idea of the white hats. The QAnon thing where white hats are there, therefore we don't have to do anything. So I'll handle it. I'm a hands-on kind of girl, being raised by you, so that's one of those, because we've been the QAnon people tote the fact that there has been so much corruption and usury, and they pinpoint some serious, again, truths about what we know about our systems today, and yet they sneak in that little, again, here the 4-to-1 rule, 4 parts truth, 1 part lie, where now you can sit and do nothing about it. Reality, so it's the same mode of attention, Jacob's ladder. It sounds like an occult symbol. And then you talk about, even when people, the term co-creators has also been criticized as one that the Anthroposophical Society, those are the people that Courtney was criticizing, they are comparing, first of all, they minimize the brain by talking about the membrane as if that singular membrane is what gives us intelligence, which is, if you've come this far with us on the book study, that is just total reduction, and you know which hemisphere that comes from. But still, they talk about this co-creation, but because it's coming from somebody of an oligarchical figure where we know there is malevolence behind their intention, we completely dismiss it. However, Jacob's ladder, this example, although it has been used by occult-like figures and those who are of the Oxford and the Cambridge, and they want to push us in a direction, Dad so beautifully painted a good picture where it applies, and the metaphor is applied to a contextual line and philosophy and vision of life and how it manifests. So it's just, that'll keep coming around now that we've gotten to this part of the book. It'll only continue further, this 4-to-1 rule. I'm sure Dad, myself, Kyle, MayCee will all be alluding to it more, because it's only going to expand, especially as more people start paying attention to this kind of work. This is such nuance type thinking, because this is new knowledge. It's regarding the brain.
And that's one of the CIA's, there was a director who, I wish, like, I do not have the mind of Matthew for names. I'm a faces dude. But the thing is that it gets mentioned that once we have a society in a position where they can't believe or trust in anything, this is when they get to bring in superstition. Yes. They get to bring it. And the reason why that works, and we've already talked about this in previous podcasts, and we're going to continue to hammer this home, because the part that is I'm looking at and where I see like the fight in the Alberta politics and the things that we're trying to sort out as a family while we're trying to move forward in these circumstances is that it works. Like they do this because it works. Why does it work? Well, since we know that the left hemisphere has an ability to trump the right hemisphere when it's in a place of fear, uncertainty, and anger. So that is a very dangerous trifecta if you let the emissary, and I'm going to repeat that, if you let the emissary outvote the master. Whereas the right hemisphere, being the master, gives the context, because that's one of its modes of attentions and primary functions, long-term memory, holding on to context. When that gets applied, that's how the spiral gets created, not Jacob's ladder. Although there's some great metaphors, we could go into a little bit of a Bible study on that because there was some neat stuff there. But once again, that is also a conversation for another time. But this is important to bear in mind, and this is why you have to think critically. How else? If you don't think critically, then when that director of the CIA was like, once we have the people in that position, well, once we have the people in that, don't be in that position. Don't be the person that's in that position. Think things through. Look for, why would they like me to think that way? Who benefits if I think that way? And what will the world look like if I think and then act that way out? And then all of a sudden you're bringing back your master, because only the master can answer those questions. The emissary can't answer those questions. Like literally, like there's more in McGilchrist's work, and I've read you guys a summary where it's like the left hemisphere will presume through representation to communicate on things that which it cannot know. It's not even designed to know it, but it will give you its theories and its confabulations as to why it is. And that's what oligarchical thinking is counting on. And this is where we see Gilchrist paint a great picture, and he's a little naive. Like he's giving examples where now we have some historical context because we've brought in other people's work. So, which is why you should be reading multiple people's works. Read a book, people.
But not just that, but also make sure you know your mode of attention going into reading the book. You have to know that, because I've met people that have even read Master and His Emissary, and they said they read it and it took them like 2 days. And then I'm like, well, then you clearly weren't like thinking what the heck you were reading, because you have to come in with like that. Well, like you don't have to, but I know from my own experience when I came in with an open receptiveness, because I didn't have any preconceived notions of the hemispheres. It was kind of just like an impressionable child that was like, oh, I'll just soak this stuff in, right? But I also had previous knowledge, as many of you did, because I also read Jordan Peterson's work, and I did Jonathan Haidt's work, and Gad Sad, and so they're just like other people where I had them to consider as well, going into this. So there were some, and I'm using some of it, but I'm finding analogies, like as I mentioned before. But so you want to take in that which you know and apply it to this book, going in with that open receptiveness, though, of like what plays, where am I getting, like, how does this apply to myself, right? Because this is essentially a book that's trying to say, how does this apply to yourself? And so you should, I guess I would recommend going into it with that openness of how it's plays with you, because if it plays with you, it plays into the real world. And then I think that, Maddie, if you go to page 250, the reason why I really like this work is because I felt like it offered a lot of accountability towards yourself, and your choices and your actions. And Gilchrist talks a lot about imitation, so in this specific chapter. So I just thought we'd go to the part, Maddie, where it says we already know from the discovery of the existence of mirror neurons. Okay.
Cyril's highlighted it for us.
Good job. Okay, Kyle or anybody else, do you guys want to like take a read of that?
Sure.
Okay.
Just from we already know.
Yep. I'll
Okay.
tell you when to stop.
Okay. We already know from the discovery of the existence of mirror neurons that when we imitate something, that we see it. Sorry, so that we can see it as if we are experiencing it. But it goes further than this. Mental representation in the absence of direct visual or other stimulus, in other words, imagining, brings into play some of the same neurons that are involved in direct perception. It is clear from this that even when we so much as imagine doing something, never mind actually imitate it, it is at some level, which is far from negligible, as if we are actually doing it ourselves. Imagining something, watching someone else do something, and doing it ourselves share important neural foundations. Imagination, then, is not a neutral projection of images on a screen. We need to be careful of our imagination, since what we imagine is, in a sense, what we are and who we become. The word imago is related to imitare, which means to form after a model, pattern, or original. There is ample evidence, some of which I said earlier, that imitation is extremely infectious. Thinking about something or even just hearing words connected with it alters the way we behave and how we perform on tasks. That's how we get psyoped, by the way. This was understood by Pascal, who realized that the path to virtue was imitation of the virtuous entanglement and virtuous habits. Sorry, engagement, not entanglement. The foundation of all monastic traditions. Let's go back to the question of how humans acquired music and language, since it helps us to understand the revolutionary power of imitation. Music and language are skills, and skills are not like physical attributes. Bigger wings, longer legs, not only can they be imitated, which obviously physical characteristics on the whole can't, but in the case of music and language, they are reciprocal skills, of no use to individuals on their own, though of more than a little use to a group. An account of the development of skills such as language purely by the competitive force of classical natural selection has to contend not only with the fact that the skills could easily be mimicked by those not genetically related, thus seriously eroding the selective power in favor of the gene, but also with the fact that unless they were mimicked, they wouldn't be much use. Imitation would itself have a selective advantage. It would enable those who were skilled imitators to strengthen the bonds that tied them to others within the group and make social groups stable and enduring. Those groups that were most cohesive would survive best, and the whole group's genes would do better or not, depending on the acquisition of shared skills that promote bonding, such as music or ultimately language. Those individuals less able to imitate would be less well bound into the group and would not prosper to the same degree. The other big selective factor in acquiring skills and fitting in with the group would be flexibility, which comes with expansion of the frontal lobes, particularly in the right frontal lobe, which is also the seat of social intelligence. Skills are intuitive, inhabited ways of being and behaving, not analytically structured, rule-based techniques. So it may be that we were selected not for specific abilities with specific genes for each, such as the language gene or music gene, not even group selected for such genes, but individually for dual skills of flexibility and the power to mimic, which are what is required to develop skills in general.
Good job. You can stop there. Yeah, no, I thought that that was a great section. Especially, I love the part where it's like this was understood by Pascal, who realized that the path to virtue was imitation of the virtuous, engagement in virtuous habits, the foundation of all monastic traditions. I just think that that encompasses really well the level of accountability that I was talking about before, which is like what, and I see it all the time actually. People already know this. Like they say it well before we got to this book. It's just this book through the work of the hemispheres and some of the neuroscience behind it helps kind of solidify the fact that it's like when you think and imagine things in the future, you quite literally are acting and behaving and going towards that thing. Like you're setting up your environment just by this mental space alone, and then it really does become something in the future, and it really does manifest in the world. And so that's why I think the level of accountability that I really like that this book gives you is the fact that you really do need to be paying attention to the kind of world that you're imagining.
Also sets the stage once again. So this has to do with what we do to invest in one another. So now this goes beyond the mental gene, because like even all the people that are on this podcast, right? A bunch of them are in this household and family members, but we're not all blood. And so here we are lifting up and trying to build each other up. And there's imitation that goes on all the time with the ideas, the conversations, the structures. You know, poor Cyril got drug into helping us pull a dog across the universe when we all went on a hike together for like 41 kilometers. And we had a dog in a trailer that made it through the first day. Now, when he looks back on that, what he got to imitate was he watched a failed idea, because let's make no mistake, that was a failed idea, turned into something else through success, through encouragement, through, well, you know, yeah, it wasn't the wisest decision on our part, some bad planning, but we turned it into something that went further, and it's going to have a larger expansive in the model that Spiral previously talked about, that's going to pay dividends for your learned experience as you move forward. And that story gets talked about or expressed with other people, and that narrative and that sharing, that this isn't selection, this is communication. This is exactly what he's talking about. This is not gene dominance. And I think it's brilliant, to be completely honest.
Yeah, there's a section here that expands upon what you just expressed. He goes into imitation as the empathetic gift that it is, but then further, as you just said, is what you alluded to also, that the oligarchs like to ignore because their left hemisphere proclivity is the, again, limits to growth. The fact that we don't have as many as they would think that we have. So I don't. Does anybody want to read this for me?
Before I read that, I'm going to add
Yep.
to what was said, because in chapter 6 summary of The Matter with Things plays right into this. So I'm just going to read it. It's small, and then I'll walk right into this. I'll read what you've asked.
Okay.
This is a chapter 6 summary of The Matter with Things, which once again, you guys know I'm in the other tome. Social and emotional understanding are central to understanding all human situations. The evidence is that the right hemisphere is of critical importance for this, including the sense of reality itself, the ability to understand what another person knows. See, another person. That has nothing to do with genes by fat. Just this is what we do. Okay, anyways, I'll continue. How that differs from what you know, what they mean, and what their unspoken intentions might be. The right hemisphere is superior at emotional expression and receptivity. It is crucial for empathy and for a sense of agency. It is important for understanding implicit meaning in all its forms, including metaphor, and for reading faces and body language. It understands how context changes meaning. In all of these respects, the evidence is that it is superior to the left hemisphere. I just feel like that complements the fact that we're talking about the social and emotional understanding, and that plays right into what was just talked. All right, so here we are. We're at the achievement of imitation.
Yep.
The achievement of imitation, the meta skill that enables all other skills, may explain the otherwise incomprehensibly rapid expansion of the brain in early hominids, since there would be a sudden takeoff in the speed with which we could adapt and change ourselves, and in the range of our abilities. Imitation is how we acquire skills, any skill at all, and the gene for skill acquisition, imitation, would trump the genes for any individual skills. Thus, from a gene, the symbol of ruthless competition, the selfish gene, that's a stab at the title of, I believe it's one of Dawkins' books, and of the relatively atomistic and oppositional values of the left hemisphere, could arise a skill that would enable further evolution to occur not only more rapidly, but in a direction of our own choosing, through empathy and cooperation, the values of the right hemisphere. Genes could free us from genes. The great human invention made possible by imitation is that we can choose who we become in a process that plays right into a philosophy of the household. Know what you are so that you can better negotiate who you are. We can choose who we become in a process that can move surprisingly quickly. As I put it above, we escape the cheerless gloom of necessity. This could also explain the apparent paradox for classical genetics, that communicative skills such as music and language would have to be acquired by individualistic competition, although the skills themselves would be of no use unless the whole group acquired them together.
Hmm.
Perhaps we are not the ruthless competitors we have been conditioned to believe ourselves to be by mechanistic models of behavior. Perhaps even the world is not a mechanism. The overwhelming importance of mimesis points to the conclusion that we had better select good models to imitate, because as a species, not only as individuals, we will become what we imitate. We will pass down the behaviors we have learned to imitate by epigenetic mechanisms, and for this reason, William James, in an inversion of the popular prejudice, saw the human species as having a larger array of apparently instinctual behaviors than any other. In the mechanical system of cause and effect, causes antedate their effects and, so to speak, push from behind. The logical extension of such systems is closure, in that ultimately what happens is determined by prior events. We go where we are pushed. Human choices appear to be open, but the existence of free will remains hard to argue for, though some have made sophisticated cases based on an understanding of the realms of theoretical physics in which cause and effect cede to probabilities and uncertainties. I am not able to evaluate these properly. Thank you for that honesty. Viewed from the phenomenological point of view, however, we feel ourselves to be free, though being pulled, drawn, attracted forward towards and by things that have a sort of magnetic power, such as archetypes, rather than pushed or prodded forward by what's happened. It may be that this is what Nietzsche had in mind when he wrote, "Action at a distance cannot be eliminated. Something draws something else closer. Something feels drawn." This is the fundamental fact. Compared to this, the mechanistic notion of pressing and pushing is merely a hypothesis based on sight and touch, even if it does serve as a regulative hypothesis for the world of sight. These important attractors are perhaps best expressed as values, though the word values sounds rather lame to me in the context. Perhaps ideals would be more like it. But this word, too, has its problems and has been discredited in our age. Agreed. These ideals or values stand outside time, unlike cause and effect. They are less minutely determining than prior causes, in that there is some choice of which attractors one resists and which one approaches. Speaking this way does not, I know, obviate questions of cause, which come back in some such guises as what caused this person to be attracted to this ideal or set of values. These are like the questions about predestination and divine grace that have vexed theology since St. Augustine, of which that's some brilliant work. I just want to put that out there because I've read a bunch of St. Augustine's work with regard to that. Got me in trouble, booted out of a few churches. That's another story for another time. Wow, am I still going? This is all in your, okay.
Yes, and this was actually some of the parts that I had questions about. So I figured, once you get this in your brain, you would give a spew and then I'd understand more.
Same. I also had questions on what you're about to read too. So
Okay, before I go, are there questions that you had like prior to what was read? Because I just read a lot. There was a lot there. How do you feel about what I just read? What were some of the questions? Did you write them down? I don't know for sure if I can answer them.
MayCee, did you have any regarding the section he just read?
Questions on this one, not particularly. I think it's mainly where you're about to go into with this values idea. Like,
Yeah, because
yeah.
like cause and effect, and that being the mechanical system, we learned that also. This, which is why Matthew's book, Science Unshackled, resonated so much with me, was because of this very thing. The first thing Matthew does is, get rid of the dichotomy of cause and effect, and how that's a closed system in of itself. So that made sense to me. And even these ideas, again, so Nietzsche, we know that there's some sketchy stuff behind him, but talking about things that people feel drawn to, everybody can relate to that. So part truth, even in Nietzsche's work, just 4-to-1 rule, throwing that out there again. But it's where he starts talking about these values that kind of, so I'll let you
Well,
continue and
I mean,
choose.
actually, I'd be first curious to ask you what you thought about the last paragraph that you just read, which was these important attractors. Because
All
you've
right.
read,
So I'm looking at Gilchrist trying to present something here.
Yeah.
This question is actually best posed for him. So
I
disclaimer.
know.
I'm
I
gonna
knew that if we could get him on the show,
yeah, right.
this is the chapter that I'd pick
yeah,
his brain
right.
on.
So
I agree.
what I but like because I still fall back to like even in his introduction, right? When it's I think MayCee you even talked about someone that had commented on your presentation, and it's like, but you're still looking at it through a system and you're still looking at it. It's like, yes, it's like if you write a book, hi, welcome to the world of left hemisphere. You just made it stasis. Like there was an era in our own history. If you recall, when Peterson talks about this is going to be a little bit of a long answer, so I'm going to do my best to get to the context of this, but I want to bring a part of this into the play because if we look at our relationship with reading as a species in contrast to like even like Cyril's trying to grind out these words and there's lots of things that even sometimes when I'm reading through this I don't understand. I've seen everybody have to run to Google, including myself, to try to go break this all down. This is the disadvantage even for Gilchrist when he go back up to the screen share, please.
Okay.
When he talks about having to like these words and the interpretations, not as in like there isn't a truth, because there is a truth, there is a reality that's downstream. It's just that's why he said like these important attractors are perhaps best expressed as values, though the word value sounds rather lame to me in the context of what it is that he's attempting to get across here. Perhaps ideals would be more like it, but this word too has its problems, has been discredited in our age. These ideals or values stand outside time, unlike cause and effect. They are less minutely determining than prior causes, in that there is some choice of which attractors one resists and which one approaches.
Right.
That's including how we've decided to have the work. Like, so a right hemisphere motive within Gilchrist's, because I don't believe that there's malevolence behind where Gilchrist is going thus far in my delving into his works. And I'm reaching the halfway mark of the first tome of his other two books that are more current. And so far, I'm still not getting, I'm seeing someone who's honestly trying to answer a question. And there is a lot of work and data that he's navigating through to do the thing. And it's getting put into words for us to do that thinking and pondering and considering. Like, how do you get 10 commandments? Moses watched the Israelites beat around the bush and screw each other over for quite a few years before that process got worked into the play. And then the laws came out. Well, what are the laws? The left hemisphere is looking for certainty. And most laws usually play to the bias of the people that are in positions of power, kind of like that line, your government will never give you the education that you need to overthrow them, right? So
Right.
the mode of attention that's being offered here that he's talking about is kind of like looking at it going, not even the words that I'm trying to offer you entirely right now are going to bring into the scope that which you yourself are immersing yourself into this work with. And that's why he goes from values to maybe ideals, but ideals, ideology, idealistic principles. Well, which downstream consequences of those are you playing out? Like, you can get those people that God believe it that settles it. Or no, God said it, I believe it, that settles it. That is a syllogism. That's a syllogistic line of thinking to something that could not be so simply understood as the pursuit of the concept of God to any individual on this planet. We write things down and we do this format, much as like he didn't even like the idea that he had to put this in a book to help us get to know our brains better. Okay. But we're very thankful that he did the thing, and he literally put the responsibility back on us, the readers. You have to take this somewhere, or not. Like, we could literally go through all of this study and even more of the research, and someone else or something else could present itself later, and we'll find out that Galileo was right. Do you know what I mean? Like, and how do we know that what McGilchrist isn't offering right now is the changing of the revolution of, instead of the Earth being the center and the sun goes around the Earth, that is to see, here we are. We believe so far in our research. So I don't know if this is helping paint the picture of what it is that he's talking about here. If it's not, please let me know. But I believe that this is what he's getting at. Now, I'm going to continue to read so we can get the rest of this. And then, Maddie, you ping me. So, by values, I do not mean the principles by which one might resolve a moral conflict. What would that be? What would principles by which one might resolve a moral conflict? Just asking, throwing it out there. Given the work that,
by the left hemisphere.
like, that's right, like a law, like a, this is it. This is how you solve the moral dilemma.
Like logic.
Right. Well, so by values, I do not mean the principles by which one might resolve a moral conflict.
Right.
Say whether to make a purely consequentialist calculus or observe Kantian deontological principles, the view that particular duties are primary or even absolute and do not depend on the value of outcomes. What is up for debate, there is not the value, say, that of preserving life, but the particular course of action in a dilemma which can best be reconciled with that value. What I mean are the values themselves that are at stake. An ideal, remember, he said, like, one could say that word as well. Whether, for example, courage or self-sacrifice have value in themselves, irrespective of the outcome or any deontological principle. Such values would, however, be excluded from the calculus of an instrumental morality. So if the rules say that I don't give my life for Kyle, that because we don't have a blood bond, or right, like, okay, so I could do that, right? That wouldn't that be an example then of that? But that wouldn't be how it would play out, right? I mean, this is why you'll see people like sort of like break their rules for another. Like, there's something more going on here, right? And this is not the okay, so you need to have evil in order for good to triumph. That is not what I'm painting at all. But just because we got to get that clear, because that gets overplayed way too much. And that's the Apollotian Dionysian cult stuff, and we don't subscribe to that. Anyways, let me continue. I think, okay, so values in this sense need to go beyond good or evil. Scheller not only distinguished realms of value, but arranged them hierarchically from the realm of those that can be appreciated only at the sense level or in terms of utility at the bottom, to the realm of the holy at the top. One may or may not be inclined to accept Scheller's particular schema of values, but what is relevant about them to the division of the hemispheres is that the left hemisphere recognizes only this lowest rank of value. Other values which Scheller ranked higher than utility, such as bravery, beauty, intelligence, holiness, require an approach that is not tied exclusively to that tool of utility. Sequentially, analytic logic, as you alluded to earlier, Maddie, when I said, what is this thing? It's like logic, a law, a rule, something static, which is not the same necessarily as saying that they involve emotion. They have to be apprehended in a different way, which is made possible by the right hemisphere's openness to what is not ultimately justifiable only in logical terms. I mean, this to me is self-explanatory what he's offering here. In the left hemisphere's world, there is, however, a way of accommodating such values by simply returning them all to the only value it knows, that of utility, lowest common denominator, right? Beauty, for example, is a way of ensuring that we select healthy reproductive partners. Bravery acts to defend territory in the interests of the gene pool. Intelligence leads to power to manipulate the environment and one's fellow creatures. Holiness is an invention designed to promote cohesion of the group, and so on. The arguments will be only too familiar, and I've heard all of these. They are well written in several, like your Sam Harris's. Like I could go on. Like such shallow thinkers. Those who are not relying solely on their left hemispheres construal of the world will detect the fraud instantly. Agreed. It is not that arguments cannot be constructed along these lines, which I do agree. But as we say in our household, that's incomplete. Although often they need to be remarkably ingenious to save the phenomena, for example, of all the myriad sources of beauty in the world. Sexual partners can only form a small part, and even their beauty is not the same as sexual attractiveness. It is just that they fail to conceive back to values which ultimately lie beyond argument. Rationality is, naturally, reluctant to accept the very possibility of a thing laying beyond rationalistic argument, since the left hemisphere cannot accept the existence of anything that lies outside itself. As always, it is the right hemisphere that is drawn to whatever is other, what lies beyond. I might keep on going.
I think
I feel like I'm doing an audiobook.
Well, this is nice because sometimes I do need to hear, and you read it. Again, this is why you're going to be great if we start doing audiobooks, because you can read it as if it's intended. So sometimes my brain like reads the same line again, or I put emphasis on a word, and then that putting emphasis kind of screws up the context of the sentence, so I have to reread it. So listening to you reading it is also helping me.
I was gonna say the next part is actually the part that is amazing. Like we needed this context in order to get to this part, I think. And so
but you do need to continue,
Yeah, and then I do think I actually would have a good one that we can end off with, but
sure.
Okay. That being the case, these attractors I speak of will appeal to the right hemisphere. But the weakness of the right hemisphere is the flip side of its strength, that it is embodied or embedded in the world. It grounds the natural viewpoint of the self, unreflecting being in the world. It therefore cannot sufficiently on its own disengage itself from the natural viewpoint, the too solid flesh of everydayness hangs about it. It therefore all too easily lapses. It is constrained by everyday reality, and its viability depends on not being unnaturally ruptured from the lived world. This is the shotgun complex that I talk about. This is where I will find myself, like, say, everybody knows that mom has a high propensity for organization and left hemispheric thinking. So we'll draw back. We'll do a ping off of Peterson's work when he says, like, people that are high in conscientiousness, and these are individuals that are great for running the business, but they don't necessarily invent the business. Like, if you're understanding my saying. And this is where, for myself, being a little bit more of a right hemispheric proclivity thinker, I actually do well as a partner and a teammate, but also, like, when you need to make the world stop and think bigger, right? And like, mom will get myopic in some regards about certain topics at certain times, and all of a sudden she'll be like, I'm feeling stuck. I don't know where to go or what to consider. And because I'm not being overly specific, I'm kind of being general about all the possibilities and functions. This is also what gets me it did get me. Like before I got onto the rigs, I was definitely a lack of action right hemispheric thinker. There's no doubt in my mind about that. But then the hierarchy that's been previously mentioned shifted, right? Family, more context, got older, certain weights of responsibility, but this is still the lived world, right? From the lived world. Anyway, so I'm hoping that this helps paint the picture. So the trouble is that the more natural its view seems to it, the less it is really allowing the extraordinary, awe-inspiring fact of the being of anything at all to be present for us. Thus, it risks, in its own way, lapsing into the inauthenticity of Heidegger's Verfallen. In this state, it is the left hemisphere that enables the willful taking up of an unnatural view. By doing this, we are enabled to ascend from the gravity of the earth on the vertical axis, if you'll remember, MayCee, when you talked about this in your presentation, vertical axis represented by the left hemisphere, and see from a different standpoint. We are able to escape temporarily the pull of the earth and see things afresh. In Heidegger's terms, Dasein becomes aware of its inauthenticity and strives towards its more authentic self. The swing towards the left hemisphere, therefore, is occasioned by the awareness of inauthenticity, and ultimately it will be the sense of inauthenticity in the world according to the left hemisphere, which will cause the return of the pendulum, the right hemisphere struggling towards something the power of which it senses from beyond the everyday instinct, intrinsic possibility. We've gone over these works, and I've talked about this in his new book, Future. I don't think we could possibly do a book study on these other two tomes. It would just like, so long. Anyways, each hemisphere risks inauthenticity from a different source, and this is brilliant. Which is why each is vital to the other. The right hemisphere is at risk from the familiarity entailed in its very engagement with the world as the world presences, coming from the void into one's right. The left hemisphere from the familiarity of cliche, I know this world. Disengaged, representation. Each cultural shift can be seen as a response to the eventual inauthenticity of the world according to one or the other of the hemispheres. But for the right hemisphere, the route back has to be through engagement with an attractive power beyond itself. And an example of this is why when we're all biking together as a family and you guys will let me have a lead, and if there is a path that we come across that I know through context I have not seen before or we haven't gone, who's the first to go squirrel? All sorts of possibility. We've gone down places where it was flooded out, you know what I mean? And all of a sudden we're like walking our bikes through it. But the thing is that that's the difference. Whereas the left hemisphere would be like, well, why would we even bother with that path? We know how to get home. We know the utility. We know where we're going. But yet when both of them play out, because both have their say and both have their crutches, if you will, obviously he's painting the picture that the left hemisphere has far more crutches in our interaction with other, which I agree completely, and we'll continue with that. But as I read that, and I'm giving these examples, this was lived for us. There's people watching this being like, well, we never bike rode with you guys. Okay, yeah, I get it. These are just examples trying to help bring this marvelous written work into something that's alive or has been lived, but it still continues to be alive. Because, well, that's what you do. Like, this plays into that metaphor we talked about where I used to get into trouble at Bible studies because I'd drop the Bible and be like, we're told that this is the living word, but that is not true. This is static. It's the same. Every time you go and open it up to whatever page, it's going to be the same every time you open it up. What is different is the quantity of time that has passed since you did the thing and the contextual story of your journey in relation to others and the world that got you to where you are when you go back into it. And then this is how it washes over you, beautifully so, in my opinion, and should still be looked at with that gracious criticisms, and it plays. So I'm hoping this kind of answered the questions to a degree.
Well, I feel like I'm still a little bit confused on one part where it says the trouble is that the more natural its view seems to it, the less it is really allowing the extraordinary, awe-inspiring fact of the being of anything at all to be present for us. Thus it risks in its own way lapsing into the inauthenticity of Hagador's Verhallen. Like, he's talking about the right hemisphere. I'm just a little bit
Right,
confused.
because once it starts to go into that realm, like playing a piano, it's going to be starting a transfer over to the left hemisphere. So the thing is that this is where familiarity has its place, but that's not the natural modality of the right hemisphere. So then all of a sudden you're going into the right hemisphere is starting to almost be obfuscated over into the left hemisphere, if you get my meaning. Like what that trends, he does explain this with the actual mechanisms of the brain. It's just now he's talking about what does this look like as a hiccup, a potential issue. And once again,
Yeah,
it's a potential issue. I mean,
I want to emphasize what you're saying, Dad, this potential issue, because MayCee, this is actually technically you, me, and then me and Dad have had conversations about, acknowledging when we talk about co-creation. I always like to lean a little, I just like to acknowledge more the fact that we are also part of the story. Like, I get context is there before us and will be long after us, but I always like to re-add the point that we are a part of said context. And that is partly, I think, due to this phenomena. The right hemisphere, it's understanding, me and MayCee, we've talked about the fact that we physically, and even in your presentation, cannot pick a position from nowhere. So even us talking about the context that is was there before us and is there after us, that is us using the left hemisphere to the right hemisphere benefit to acknowledge what he's saying. That is which is beyond, because the right hemisphere can't disembody itself. So even though it acknowledges context, it cannot talk about and embody things other than the fact that its own body and it's in its own position from somewhere. So my position that I usually take is that right hemisphere, which could potentially become a problem if I don't continue to acknowledge the context that was there before me and is there afterwards, and I get too stuck in the embodying the very fact that I can't not embody, right, my own context, because again, the right hemisphere is concerned with what's personal, right, and it acknowledges what it's going through in its own lived context. Although I do think it's important to, I can't not think it's important. Again, that's kind of what he's kind of saying. The right hemisphere can't escape that very fact that it'll always come back to its own lived context. So when I put emphasis on that, when we're talking about philosophical discussions in the household, Dad always reminds me, which is the left hemisphere taking of the thing that is beyond ourselves, funnily enough. That's where I think McGilchrist is bringing in the nuance, because originally I thought that was it's a disembodiment, to look at to try and ignore your own lived context. I always believed that was a disembodiment, and it still partly could be so. But what McGilchrist seems to be arguing to me is that it's a necessary, is what I'm hearing, even though we kind of criticize the we don't need the Aristotles. McGilchrist is saying that there is a fundamental need for the left to the right and the right to the left. He's arguing that they need one another. And so this is where I believe we should adopt the two things can be true at the same time. Plato doesn't need Aristotle. However, Aristotle's there. So same thing, the left and the right hemisphere, they're both there, and they both have their purposes and their roles. And together, sometimes they benefit one another, and they can do so in various ratios. But this is how I'm understanding, based off of like literal conversations that you and I have had, where I embody that the natural view, too much in the natural view that he's alluding to, is almost overly focusing on your every day-to-day context. It's very, very helpful on a various range of things, which is why Dad said it's a potential problem. it's a potential problem, which is what McGilchrist is alluding to, because he's building this hypothesis about why these shifts happen. So he believes that this potential problem is cause for some of the shifts that have occurred, is this overly embodiment of the everyday personal context type thing, and then not acknowledging what dad always calls, the humbling thyself to the vast that is not us. So it's it's a nuanced thing because it's not a common application. Like even the fact that I can draw on that because I've been thinking that way in some of our conversations, it's nuanced and it's a potential problem. And I think he's going to develop it more as he builds the examples, because this is a hypothesis. Dad said a potential problem. We're going to see where McGilchrist thinks this problem plays out. So it will get answered more, because this is only 17 pages, this chapter, and he's about to go into a whole realm. So I believe we'll see more examples and be able to identify how much nuance this really does get applied to and not.
Yeah, and there's like, this also is why does the frog take the scorpion across?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the pattern, according to the utility of the left hemisphere, is there shouldn't be a frog ever in the metaphor, given the quantity of frogs that have been murdered by the nature of the left hemisphere of the scorpion. But it does the thing. Like, you're asking the frog to not do, almost like this is what's intriguing about even the way Gilchrist set this up. The very nature that is the scorpion's excuse for killing the frog and then drowning them both is also almost the same nature. The right hemisphere's weakness is potential. Even in the left hemisphere, like the scorpion, the frogs to the scorpion. So you're asking for a formula to that which doesn't really, there's a pattern, but it's not a formula. If you understand my meaning. And it's gonna still try to bring the scorpion across, because sooner or later it knows it's getting one of them across. And it's important to do that.
So MayCee, did you have any further things, or?
I could be wrong. It was just a thought popped in my head where it's if you bombard because in schizophrenic patients, what happens is sometimes, and that's more of like a left hemisphere proclivity type of ailment. What happens is if you bombard them with, or even just let them be what they are, they see things as very fragmented and they kind of like get distracted towards different things. But sometimes they'll describe it as having no interest to them, where it's like, I'm drawn to it, but I'm not interested in what I'm drawn to. And so it sounds like a manipulation of the right hemisphere in society when you are bombarding your hemispheres, because you have two. When you're bombarding it, it's like the right hemisphere, almost like if it has that thing of potential, like this weakness for it, it's like wanting maybe to adopt it personally, but it's too much, like a lot to hold. And I feel like maybe that plays into why it's like what dad you said, which is like when you were younger, you were the type of right hemisphere where you didn't really get things done, but you were kind of always like, ooh, and like this and this. I mean,
shotgun attention is what I used to call it, right? Because it's like you're getting drawn to so many things, but you're actually never taking the time to let your left hemisphere specifically put some attention on something. And then the right hemisphere will be like, well, if I put my attention on this, what are its potentials and possibilities? Left hemisphere, those potentials and possibilities that you just offered, that has potential for me. So then between the two of them, the symbiosis of, well, so you discipline yourself to work on the drilling rigs for 17 years for your family. Then all of a sudden there's this symbiotic relationship of a downstream outcome of both of them in cooperation to have the thing. I wouldn't have been able to do that. Like, I look at what the drilling rigs did for me, and it was like disciplining of the right hemisphere, almost through some left hemisphere bludgeoning, if you will. But yet at the same point in time, what ended up happening is that I started to change the system on the rigs, and the crew dynamic and the camaraderie was what all of a sudden made the rig alive. Like something very alive happened on the rig and with the crew that some didn't ever see. They thought that like, I know that there were those who came before me on the rigs that had these similar experiences because it's brains, there's hemispheres playing out. But at the time, there was individuals that weren't thinking that way because we have a society that creates left hemispheric thinkers. So here it was, these guys are getting pinged and they're belonging to this crew, and we're working with all this physical left hemisphere built structures because you can't make a civilization without a tape measure, right? So this is how it plays. If you overwhelm the right hemisphere with all sorts of possibility and potential, it almost sits there and lets the devil's advocacy, where we know that it takes longer, like it'll ponder a longer than the left hemisphere, because the left hemisphere is going to go to utility and power immediately. And how does it do that? Manipulation primarily. So it's just going to sit back and be like, yeah, so while you're sitting there thinking about it, I'm going to be the master in this situation. And away we go. And then there it is. Like, there's almost too much unnatural thinking of the right hemisphere going on for the potentials and possibilities. That's why the argument that we've seen so far up into the work is the beauty of the symbiosis of the hemispheres.
Which is a negotiation, which I think he really starts to emphasize. These potential problems, the reason it's potential is because the negotiations can play out on a myriad of ways, because everybody has a little bit of their own. I guess I should move into sustained attention, since we're kind of coming on the time here, and this is literally playing into my sustained attention exercise, is that very nuance of the negotiation. He did a line in one of the pages. I know it seems like we read a lot, but we did not read the entire chapter. And it goes, "Le style, c'est l'homme." And that means like the style is the man. He talks about how imitation, as paradoxically as it seems, makes room and shows the areas of individuality. How, again, studying the particular also leads you to more expansive areas. So, and that's a negotiation that actually plays out, because I believe, and me and MayCee have talked about this, studying this work and understanding my brain has personally brought me closer to God, whatever that is for me. And vice versa, imitating others has also brought me closer to me, because I literally imitate MayCee and Dad to become the person that I am today. So it's not necessarily, paradoxically, that is the negotiation, that is the nuance, the quiddity, the essence that can only, it can't be formulated as Dad said. There will be patterns, and that's what this negotiation he's talking about is this is the pattern, but you can't formulate that negotiation, because it'll resonate a little bit differently for each of us who has our own circumstance to do that thing. But that's my sustained attention, is that 4-to-1 rule. That's the nuance that ends up appearing, that we have to navigate through all dynamics, because that is all dynamics. So that's for me. Does anybody want to volunteer to go sustained, or shall I appoint?
I can go ahead.
Okay.
As far as we see in not just this chapter, all the other chapters, like there's that battle between the two hemispheres vying for, I don't want to say control, but for their say in being allowed to influence the world around them. That battle it's only a battle as the left hemisphere sees it. There's a quote right at the end of the book of this, right at the end of this chapter that I'm going to butcher a little bit, but it's like, only the left hemisphere sees the battle between the hemispheres as a battle. The right hemisphere looks at it as like what word did he use? Reverberating process that is just brought into being like all other facets of life are. It's the It's the negotiation. The right hemisphere understands that it's a negotiation. The left hemisphere only sees it as a battle because the left hemisphere has power within its set of values. When we were talking about values or principles, right? That utilitarianism and power, that's your left hemisphere's value. And so that's what it wants to bring into the world. The right hemisphere understands relationship, context, and the lived.
Yeah,
That
I
is
think
all.
for my sustained attention, it would be I had a conversation with Maddie the other day, and I remember describing what was going on in a person's brain when they're thinking of a specific situation. And I found myself going like, because it would be like the right hemisphere would think this, but then I thought, but no, but then again, but then the left hemisphere would do it, and the right, and I kept on going the right, blah, 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 and I couldn't like ad infinitum. Like I remember myself doing that. I just thought to myself, oh my gosh, it happens on like such a fucking millisecond by millisecond thing. It is not just linear the way I described it, but language is very fucking linear. It's parallel as well. Um, and then not to mention like we always say, like hemispheres, then like age, sorry, gender then age. Um, but it's like my sustained attention, I believe that he said as well, where it was like where war is like the king and the father of like life. Peace is the queen and mother, right? And so it was, I think that it's it is even on the larger scale and on the minor scale of how we're trying to understand how they communicate with one another. It's also how we're communicating on the macro of with one another. And I think that it's not that it's this Carl Jung thing of like where like it needs to go beyond just good and evil, where it's like, oh, you need evil for good and you need good for evil. But it's like it's not about that. It's more so like uh there there is an atmosphere surrounding us, and when you ping out frequencies, they do a thing. And I feel like we're doing a thing as one of the frequencies within, right, the context ad infinitum, right? And so uh I think then it's just up to us to try almost like the reason why sometimes I come back to Escher's hands is because it's like trying to trace your origin. And I feel like it is though that reverberative process of like you don't, it's not like you don't get one without the other, but you get the other within the one. So, but yeah, that's my little assessment there.
Cyril, are you still with us?
Yes, yes, I'm here. Um, I'm gonna be honest. As I've said many times before,
Mhm.
this brain just doesn't like this book just does not stay in my head. Like I genuinely don't remember what I read about. So like my sustained attention here is non-existent. So I'm sorry. Like I genuinely don't remember.
Okay.
You're forgiven, Cyril.
He remembered to show up. That's good.
That's true. You do show up, and I think that's part of the reason why this is so vital and that we're doing this book study in the first place is because this is a cultural problem that needs to it's vital. It is vital
We
to
will
our
MK Ultra you with our stuff
Yeah, I was
until
gonna
you
say,
scroll
I
on your
mean,
phone.
you know, he's made the mistake of getting himself engrossed with our family. So there's going to be consequences, which doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be a good or a evil. It just is. So
Mhm.
that's okay. That will help. We'll get him to drag dogs around the countrysides in carts, and all of a sudden he's going to look back on it and be like, "Ping!" His right hemisphere will wake up and he'll be like,
Right.
this
At
thing
least you
happened.
know his
So
subconscious right
yeah,
hemisphere has been garnering this knowledge the entire time. It's just he's in the height of his left hemisphere development, but it'll ping when he's 20.
Can you imagine if he
Maybe.
comes back and he's just like, "Oh my God, guys, remember that podcast?"
yeah, yeah.
Okay, Dad.
Um, my sustained attention. Um, I'm really when we're going over this, because I've done this book a few times now, and so as I've mentioned before, watching you guys navigate it, and it helps bring more flavor if there was that sensation that, or a question that would be like, I hate saying like, that would be, are there more colors in the kaleidoscope? That's what linearly transcends to give that extra view, and then gets me more of a horizon to gaze upon for where to go. Because if there's anything that we are also trying to encourage with the disseminating of this work, and we mentioned several people, like other podcasts and influencers, be it for good or for bad, right? There's many of them that we have mentioned. You could argue, right? Like I see things that have me concerned about your Petersons and your Daily Wires, and I used to pay attention to all of them. Your Louders with Crowders and your Tim Pool. Sorry. Anyway, and it's like, so all of that's out there, and there's been a journey of this clan with regards to knowing who you are to better negotiate, or sorry, knowing what you are to better negotiate who you are. And it's intriguing because as one who's in discussion, even though it'd be in my own household and any others who join in this in the podcast, but also we're now starting to meet people outside of the podcast that are following, or they too are in this very same circumstance that we're in. They're trying to navigate their way through it. So I feel like I see a sincerity in Gilchrist's questions, and I believe that we have an authenticity about how we're going about it, as Matthew has healthily been kind enough to offer that defense to those who might feel like, oh, these poor naive dumb Holmeses and friends, they're going to get played by another oligarch shill such as like an Aldous Huxley or Julian Slade. I disagree. I believe that we are thinking this through with more authenticity, the possibility of our axioms needing to be changed and our heroes to be disregarded. And I believe that plays a role in what we just went over in chapter 7. And as I've always said, and many ones before, I'm looking forward to the unraveling of part 2. I'm seeing, because I'm working on his new works, a lot of similar arguments. More evidence is in his newer works, might I add, too. So for those who truly have the ambition to transcend, to dive deep, then continue with his extra work, because as far as I'm concerned, it's still irrefutable at this point in my journey. But it doesn't mean that it's irrefutable. See, that's the important part. That's the 4-to-1. That's where we are as honest people with this podcast, with the reading of the book, with the conversations, whether we get left hemisphere locked for a moment on topics, or we get right hemisphere non-specific to potential, and we find ourselves spinning our tires a little bit. People are starting to watch it honestly play out, and that is where mirror neurons, the coding of the brain, the things that it actually does that we learned in the first half of Master and his Emissary, that's playing out. So that's my sustained attention, is considering the long-term sustained attentions of those who are watching and following us in this journey.
Way to bring the Holmes home, Dad. That was great. With that being said, everybody go into the description box. There will be 2 podcasts, one of which is MayCee's presentation. The other one will be the Courtney, Matthew, and my father podcast, which play into this.
In advance.
It is 3 hours. I think she set a record for the longest RDF presentation, though don't quote me on it. Otherwise, the link for the book is also in the description. We will see everybody in a month. And if you want to join us, email us. Thank you, everybody, for coming. That was great.
Thank you. Cheers.